Hello, everyone. So today we're going to be going over our model for the 2024 presidential election. And for this, we will use 0 to 2 will be a tilt margin, 2 to 5 will be leans, 5 to 10 will be likely, and over 10 will be safe. So let's go ahead and start talking about safe blue states. So Washington, Oregon, California, Hawaii. So in Hawaii, there was a poll that came out in the summer that showed Trump within three when Joe Biden still the presumptive nominee for the Democrats. And I still think that the state is going to move to the right, but it's still going to be very much a safe blue state at the presidential level. I'll say to Colorado, this is not, I don't think, quite as far gone as some Republican strategists have said. I think that a Ted Cruz or Mark Field can be interesting in a presidential year under the right circumstances. However, for this election cycle, even with Trump's visit to Aurora, I still think it's going to be slightly over 10 points for the margin of victory for the state for the Harris campaign. And if we head over to the East Coast, we have Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, DC, and we also have Maine's first district, as well as the state of Vermont and the state of New York. Now, some interesting things have been happening in this area here, where there is in certain areas very enthusiastic support for Trump. For example, in Rhode Island, outside of Providence, there's also in far northwestern, excuse me, northeastern Vermont. I think Trump can do well there. He also, I think, could possibly get New Jersey under 10. And he might have you might see a shift in to the left or to the right in Delaware now that Joe Biden is no longer nominee. So overall, though, this is a very solid Democrat region. Although a lot of areas have been shifting to the right, and particularly New York City, what we saw in 2012, as well as some of the rural counties in upstate New York, as well as rural New Jersey. Both Western and Eastern Maryland, Trump will do very well in those states, but this is a state that's carried very heavily by the city of Baltimore. And last but not least, we have the state of Illinois, which will be heavily carried by Chicago. But I do think that some of the micropolitan areas and some of the college towns not very keen on a Republican populist. So I think that Harris Walz will have be comfortable in here again. The Democrats in the state of Illinois. Let's then go ahead and discuss the safe red states. We have Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, both of the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma. We're also going to have Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Republicans again winning much of the Old South, as well as Indiana, West Virginia, and South Carolina. And I will also add here the states of Ohio and Iowa. I've been relatively reluctant to do this, but based on what we're seeing with some of the polling and some of the modeling, I think that uh, these states will be closer to a 10-point win than a 20-point win. That's almost a guarantee. But if they are likely, if Trump doesn't have that great of a night, it'll probably be 9 points and change um, as far as margin of victory goes. But um, and I do think that these states are probably more elastic in the sense that um, if Trump was not on the ballot, I think that these both of these states would probably shift to the left by some degree. You can also put the state of Florida in with the safe Republican states as well. Just looking at voter registration patterns, particularly in the last 4 years, Republicans have made significant gains. They also are doing well with early voting. And so there's a very strong possibility that this state will be over 10 points, but it's not going to be a flip for the Democrats. The real argument, again, like with Colorado, is if it's going to be likely or so I do not have any likely Democrat states on the map at this time. So we will go with the likely Republican states. I think that will be the state of Texas. There's an argument for Alaska to be likely as well, but I think considering that this is a presidential year and the Trump campaign has a lot of momentum late, that Alaska will be a safe state. But I think Texas, it could be safe. I think that Trump will probably win it by about 7.2 points. I don't think that the Senate race is going to have that much of an impact on the presidential race. And I do think that this state is really not in contention to be flipped to the Democrats. And let's talk about then the states where we have states that lean. So I will go ahead and put Maine at large as lean, although it would not be surprising me if this went to tilt. Um, Additionally, I think that we can say New Mexico is going to be uh, lean. I think that the state is considered a dark horse flip for Donald Trump, but considering that the majority of the Hispanics in New Mexico will, at the end of the day, I think probably break for the Democrat candidate Kamala Harris. And additionally, there's also a fairly large liberal Anglo population that still lives in New Mexico. And so this is kind of a little bit tougher of a state to flip. It's also for the Republicans, it's not also really a priority state because of its paltry 5 electoral. And so we can then discuss the lean Republican states. North Carolina, I believe, will be lean, as well as the state of Georgia. And what we're kind of seeing with North Carolina, I do realize Kamala Harris has spent some time campaigning here. I think they felt like with some of their initial momentum that they could maybe pull a 2008 Barack Obama and get a lot of black turnout and some of the more ancestrally Democrat turnout, like along the Virginia border and in some parts of Wilmington and some of the Charlotte area. But I think that the state has been voting to the right ever since, and it's still going to be considered a swing state. But they consistently have elected Republican senators, and so at the federal level, North Carolina is a pretty decent bet that it's going to stay in the Republican column. I will also put the state of Arizona in this column. I think that the polls are slightly underestimating Donald Trump in this case. I also think that a lot of the issues that he had in the 2016 campaign with more social conservative and Mormon voters, and some of his comments about professional sports organizations in 2020, a lot of that has faded. I also think the rivalry with the McCains has faded to a certain degree. I don't expect Kari Lake Senate race to have any upward ballot effects on the president. And so I do think that he'll win the state by about 2 to 3 points. Um, so now we can also go to the tilt Democrat states. And so at this point, I would say that the only tilt state for the Democrats, or the most obvious one, would be the state of New Hampshire. And the reason why the state of New Hampshire I have as tilt is because I think that there's been a late surge of support for Trump in the state. New Hampshire used to be known for not liking incumbents. It used to be known for having a libertarian streak. But I think that some demographic changes in the last 6 years or so have pushed the state more towards the left. I also think that they're more influenced by some of the more left wing marketing that we see in cities like Boston, and as well as neighboring Vermont. I know a lot of folks in New Hampshire may not appreciate that, but I do think that surrounding states are having a bit of an impact here. This is not the state that what it used to be, and we kind of saw those trends change with the election of with them consistently electing Democratic senators at the federal level. In the governor's race, I do expect that to be a lean type of victory for the Republicans, but it's going to be, I think, a fairly tough state to flip. It's not something that the Republicans have put a lot of energy into flipping just because of its low electoral vote count. And so, if we look at the remaining map here, we look at the states that really, I think, are going to determine the election. Now, Minnesota, I'll also say this will be a lean Democratic state as opposed to a tilt state. And the reason for this is because I do think that um, there's more negative energy coming out of the state for Tim Walz than positive. And I think it's because the rural part of the state has really, I think, for the last several years felt ignored by the DFL politicians in St. Paul. And you can almost kind of see that there's a corridor between 494 and 694, the interstates that surround much of the Twin Cities metro, and a very large chunk of what we would call greater Minnesota. Now, this state has not voted Republican since Richard Nixon, um, and that had to do with the Vietnam War more than anything else. And we have not seen the state um, really vote consistently Republican, really even for certain statewide offices um, for some time. And the issue with Minnesota, at least from the Republican perspective, is that Minnesota always has high turnout compared to the rest of the country. And so much of the population is concentrated in the eastern part of the state. So it would be like downtown Duluth, the Twin Cities area, Rochester, which is traditionally more of like a Republican establishment area, which means that they're not going to be really keen on electing a populist candidate. So, with such high turnout in a lot of these kind of liberal bastion areas, it's tough for the state to. And a lot of the rural counties in Minnesota, the culture's a little bit different with the DFL party. Trump has done a pretty nice job of getting those folks on board um, with his campaign and his agenda and convincing them to vote Republican, at least at the top of the ticket. But you're not going to see counties in Minnesota voting like you would see in rural Texas, Nebraska, or Alabama at 85 to 90% for Donald Trump. It's going to be more of like in the 60s and 70s, maybe the upper 50s for some of the counties that are more where the DFL is more locally engaged. And so Minnesota is just going to be a really tough flip. Trump would have to have a really good night, I think, to flip the state of Minnesota. But I don't think that Tim Walz is really adding a whole lot um, to the ticket as far as the state goes, because I don't think he's disliked enough where it's going where he would be the reason why if Harris Walz were to lose the state. But it's also not going to make this a safe state either. I do think it's more likely that it's going to be greater than 5 points than under 2 points. And one question that I get a lot too, being from the state, is, well, what about the riots that occurred in the protests in 2020? And some commentary is, well, they burned down their cities. Well, the most of the people in the metro area were not directly affected by that. It was limited to a few isolated areas. And that's just really kind of, when you look at it in the geographical sense, that's the reality of the situation. So I don't know that that's really being appropriately characterized, especially when you're analyzing an election. And so I do think that Minnesota is, in any case, going to stay in the blue column. The final states here, which are ultimately going to decide the election, we look at Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Nevada. I'm fairly confident that President Trump is going to eke out a victory here in Nevada. Now, I do know that there's a very strong union presence in Las Vegas, which has continued on after the quote unquote green machine. Um, but Las Vegas has been gingerly trending to the right. And I do think Republicans have a case with their early vote lead, that they will be able to still hold on to the state, even with the Democrats doing a last minute push in Clark County. If you look at some of the numbers and some of the modeling, Trump doesn't have to win Las Vegas or Clark County outright to win the state. Um, but I think it's going to be close. But I do think that right now he would be favored to win. And also, if we look at the remaining three states here, which is what I think it's all going to come down to, is the Rust Belt. Looking at the state of Wisconsin, if you look at the RCP average, Harris has a lead right now. But I do think that this is a state that pollsters have been notoriously missing. And I haven't seen anything to suggest that that methodology has been improved upon. And so I do think that this is a state that Donald Trump will win. And it will probably be the state that it could give him the election depending on how close things are in the state of Pennsylvania, and how soon they get their results in. But I do think Wisconsin is going to go for Trump. I also think the same thing is going to be true for Pennsylvania, simply because of the Republicans have really done a pretty good job actually of their ground game, particularly in eastern Pennsylvania, really heavily focused on areas that were loyal to President Biden. And so a lot of these workers are, a lot of these voters, I should say, they're workers as well. But a lot of this area here, you're looking at kind of the Obama Trump voter. And I think that they are probably going to, in a lot of cases, switch their votes over to Donald Trump this time around. I also think you're going to see turnout dip in Philadelphia a little bit, also possibly in Allegheny County in Pittsburgh. I also think you might see turnout go down in Center County, which is where Penn State is. And overall, the Republicans have shaved a lot off of the margin in terms of both early voting and Democratic Party registration. So they've made a lot of significant gains in the state, and I think that Trump is probably going to win Pennsylvania by about 2.1 points. Now, Michigan is a state that I think is going to be perhaps the closest in the election, and I've seen a lot of folks who originally had Trump winning the state now having it go to Harris, but I think that with the model that I currently have, that this is going to stay voting consistently with Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. And these three states historically have voted in tandem. And I do think that these kind of regional macro trends still matter to a certain extent. And I'm really kind of putting my confidence in right now the Atlas Intel poll, which had Trump up by 2. And also the Red Eagle Politics channel also ran a poll. It's an outdated poll now, but it was, I think, a fairly honest poll. The channel itself is Trump leaning, but it had Trump with a lead of 3 points. So I do think that even though Michigan is not really quite as rural as Wisconsin, that Michigan is still going to be going into the Trump column. Now, it would not surprise me if Harris and Tim Walz were able to hold on to the state for the Democrats. It is a very purple state, but I do think that with trends that we're seeing in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, that we're going to see, I think, similar trends occurring in the state of Michigan, particularly with groups that generally don't vote Republican coming out with some pretty strong support. And the last two regions we can look at here is the Maine second congressional district. I think this will go safe. It's really a debate between safe and likely, but I think this will be a safe uh, electoral vote for Donald Trump. Trump actually did, I think, a nice job of identifying that this was a district that could be flipped, even way back in 2015, 2016. And I think his running start has really helped him galvanize a lot of support that has been pretty loyal to him over the last decade. Nebraska's second. This is, I think, sort of a slippery electoral vote in the sense that, in theory, it's really one that could go either way. If Trump has a really good night, he should land it. Um, but at the same time, I also think that Omaha is just it's more liberal than people realize, and that's really kind of true of also of Kansas City to a certain extent. But you could make the argument that from the Canadian border on down to Austin, that the most liberal city in kind of that vicinity is Omaha, and so I think I will go ahead and give this um, to Harrison Walls. We'll go ahead and give it to him by a tilt margin. It could be a lean margin as well. But I think that there's going to be a surge in maybe some of the outer areas, like in Sarpy County, for example, where the margin could be a little bit closer than what's being polled. But I do think um, Harrison Walls will win this. I think that Don Bacon and the Republicans are going to retain that seat by by a, by a small margin as well. So I do think that there might be a little bit of ticket splitting going on. And so there you have it, folks. It's 226 for the Democrats and 312 for the Republicans.